A sharp smack rang out, sounding like a fatal gunshot. Just a second ago, the Saturday morning cafe was buzzing with familiar sounds. The hissing of the espresso machine, the clinking of silverware, and dozens of overlapping conversations. But the very next second, the entire place went dead silent, leaving everyone breathless. Victoria Stanton's palm slammed hard against the left side of Marcus Jackson's face, a blow so powerful it startled everyone nearby. At the counter, a woman visibly shook and dropped her cup. Over by the window table, a child froze completely in fear. Yet Marcus didn't even flinch. He stood there like a stone statue, tightly holding his young daughter against his chest, his large hand wrapping behind her head as if sheltering her from something far worse than a slap. No staggering, no shouting. He simply turned his head slowly and deliberately, locking Victoria in a cold, hollow, completely unsurprised stare, a gaze so piercing that many witnesses later admitted it was the most terrifying thing they had ever seen in their lives. Right then, Victoria's bodyguard stepped forward to do his job. But the moment he closed the distance to just 3 feet from Marcus and caught sight of the long scar running down the left side of his face, he froze in his tracks. The brute's face turned pale in an instant, and he took a trembling step back. If you're new here, please stay tuned. Dramatic and mysterious stories like this are the heart and soul of this channel. Hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss the shocking truths about to unfold. Marcus Jackson woke up at 6:15 every Saturday morning without an alarm. It wasn't a habit he had chosen, so much as one his body had refused to let go of 15 years out of the army. And he still couldn't sleep past dawn. He didn't fight it anymore. He made coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the quiet, and listened to the particular stillness of the apartment before the rest of the world caught up. By 7, Ava was awake. He always knew the exact moment she crossed from sleep into waking, because the entire apartment shifted a small 7-year-old seismic event that announced itself through the sound of feet hitting the floor, a drawer being opened and shut 3 times, and then the appearance of his daughter in the kitchen doorway, wearing mismatched socks and an expression of complete seriousness. "Is it a park day?" she asked, the same way she asked every Saturday. "It's a park day," he said, the same way he answered every Saturday. She allowed herself exactly 1 second of visible excitement before turning back toward her room to get dressed. Marcus watched her go and felt the kind of quiet happiness that had no name, the kind that didn't announce itself, that simply sat in your chest and stayed there. He was not a complicated man to look at. Tall, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his early capitalized 40s, with close-cropped hair and a face that had been weathered rather than aged. He wore a plain gray t-shirt and dark jeans. He owned nothing that cost more than it needed to. He drove a used truck, lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in a decent part of the city, and worked 3 days a week doing logistics consulting for a mid-sized shipping company, enough to keep the lights on, enough to be home when Ava needed him. The scar ran from his left temple down along the curve of his jaw, a long, pale ridge of healed tissue that pulled slightly at the corner of his eye when he smiled. People noticed it. They always did. Some asked, most didn't. He never explained it to anyone, and he had learned long ago that the silence itself was enough to make people stop asking. He never talked about where it came from. He never talked about a lot of things. By 8:30, they were walking through the door of a cafe called Groundwork, on the corner of 5th and Meridian, their standing Saturday stop before the park, a tradition that had started the winter after his wife died and had not been broken once in 3 years. Ava held his hand and told him about a drawing she had made at school of a horse that she admitted looked more like a dog. Marcus listened to every word. Groundwork was busy the way it always was on Saturday mornings. Every table taken, a line stretching back from the counter, the smell of fresh bread mixing with dark roast coffee. Marcus ordered his usual black coffee, and Ava's usual hot chocolate, found a small table near the window, and for a few minutes, everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. Ava was mid-sentence about the horse that looked like a dog when she slid off her chair to point at something she had spotted on the chalkboard menu above the counter. She turned too fast. The hot chocolate went first, the cup tilting out of her small hand in a slow, inevitable arc that Marcus was a half-second too late to catch. It hit the floor and splashed upward in a wide fan of dark liquid, and a significant portion of it landed across the shoes of the woman standing directly behind Ava. The woman was Victoria Stanton. Marcus knew who she was, the way most people in the city did, from the business section, from the occasional magazine cover, from the low-level ambient awareness that came with being one of the wealthiest people in a mid-sized American city. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, dressed in a manner that made the inside of the cafe look underdressed by comparison, and she was holding a phone to her ear when the hot chocolate hit her shoes. She looked down at her shoes. She looked at Ava. Ava, still on the floor where she had stumbled, looked up at her with wide eyes, already filling with tears, the expression of a child who knows something has gone wrong and is waiting to find out how bad it is going to be. Victoria ended her phone call. "What is wrong with you?" she said. Her voice was not loud. It was worse than loud. It was precise and deliberate, each word placed carefully for maximum effect. "Do you have any idea what you just did? Look at these shoes. Do you even know what these cost? Where are your parents? Who lets a child run around a public place like this?" Ava started to cry. Marcus was out of his chair before Victoria finished her second sentence. He crossed the space between them in 4 steps, crouched down beside Ava, and wrapped one arm around her without looking away from the floor, checking her knees, her hands, making sure she hadn't hit anything when she stumbled. She hadn't. He pulled her gently upright, kept one hand on her shoulder, and then stood to his full height and looked at Victoria Stanton for the first time. "She's 7 years old," he said. "She tripped. Are you hurt?" The question was directed at Ava, not Victoria. Ava shook her head, pressing her face against his side. "Then we're going to get you cleaned up," he said quietly to his daughter. Then he looked back at Victoria. "I'll pay for the cleaning, but I'd like you to apologize to my daughter." The cafe had gone noticeably quieter around them. Not silent. Not yet. But the conversations nearest to them had thinned out in the way that happens when people are pretending not to listen, while listening very carefully. Victoria looked at him, the way she might look at something she had nearly stepped in. "Apologize?" she repeated. The word came out flat and faintly amused, as though he had said something genuinely absurd. "Your daughter just destroyed a pair of shoes that cost more than you probably make in a month. I'm not going to apologize for pointing that out. She's a child," Marcus said. "She made a mistake. That's different from doing something wrong. I don't need a lesson in child development from you." Victoria glanced around the cafe with the ease of someone who had never once worried about an audience. "You want to do something useful? Take your daughter home and teach her how to behave in public." Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't move closer. He simply stood where he was and said, "I'm going to ask you one more time. Please apologize to my daughter." Something shifted in Victoria's expression, a tightening around the eyes, a slight elevation of her chin. It was the look of a person who had not been spoken to this way in a very long time and found the experience genuinely offensive. "You have no idea who you are talking to," she said, her voice dropping half a register. "I have personal relationships with 3 members of the city council, the deputy chief of police, and 2 senior judges. I make one phone call, and you won't just lose this argument. You'll lose custody of that child before the end of the week. Child Protective Services takes anonymous tips very seriously, especially when they come from credible sources." The words landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water. Ava heard them. Marcus felt her go rigid against his side, felt her small fingers find his hand, and grip it with both of hers. She looked up at him with an expression that broke something open in his chest. Pure, uncomplicated fear. He looked down at her. He thought about the drive home, about the park waiting 3 blocks away, about every version of this moment that ended with him walking out the door quietly and teaching his daughter, without meaning to, that there were people in this world whose anger you simply had to absorb. He looked back at Victoria. He didn't move. Victoria made the first call before Marcus said another word. She stepped back half a pace, pulled out her phone with the practiced ease of someone who had ended arguments this way before, and spoke to whoever answered in a clipped, businesslike tone that made it clear she was not asking for help. She was issuing instructions. Marcus heard the words Times attorney, harassment, and Times documentation. Times before she lowered her voice deliberately, turning slightly away as though the conversation were private. Despite the fact that every person within 15 feet could hear every word, she finished the call and looked at him with something that was almost satisfaction. "My attorney will be here in 20 minutes, she said. "In the meantime, I'd strongly suggest you sit back down. You can also expect a call from someone at CPS within the hour." She continued, slipping her phone back into her bag, with a small, precise movement. "I have a contact there. Wonderful woman. Very thorough. She takes her job extremely seriously, especially when there are concerns about a child's home environment." At the counter, 2 of the cafe's staff members had stopped pretending to work. A barista in her 20s stood with a milk pitcher in her hand, completely motionless, watching the exchange with an expression caught somewhere between alarm and helplessness. The manager, a heavy-set man in his 40s, had appeared from the back and was hovering near the register, visibly trying to calculate the least damaging way to intervene with someone who came in 4 times a week and tipped generously. He didn't intervene. At the tables closest to the window, 3 customers had their phones out. One was already filming. 2 others were texting rapidly, glancing up every few seconds. Marcus stood exactly where he had been standing since the beginning of this. His hand rested on Ava's shoulder. She had stopped crying, but she was pressed tight against his side with both arms wrapped around his waist, communicating without any ambiguity that she did not want him to move. "You done?" Marcus asked. Victoria blinked. It was a small reaction, barely visible, but it was there. She had expected quite a few responses to what she had just said. That particular response was not among them. "I beg your pardon?" "You made your calls," Marcus said. "You said what you wanted to say. I'm still here. My daughter is still here. And I'm still asking you to apologize to her." The room was quiet enough now that the espresso machine behind the counter sounded almost aggressive. Victoria looked at him for a long moment, really looked at him, the way she might examine a structural problem she couldn't immediately identify the source of. Then, something hardened behind her eyes, and she took one slow step forward. The bodyguard, until now stationed near the door, began moving toward them. The slap came without warning. Tiếng chat vang lên một lần nữa, nhưng ngắn và đanh hơn. Nhạc nền dừng hẳn, để lại một khoảng lặng dài 2 giây. The cafe went silent. Not the partial, uncertain quiet of before complete silence. The kind that falls when something happens that no one present knows how to process. Someone near the counter exhaled audibly. A child at the table by the window started crying, not because anything had happened to her, but because the sound alone had frightened her. The barista with the milk pitcher set it down on the counter very slowly, as though sudden movements might make things worse. Ava did not cry. She went completely still, her arms still wrapped around her father's waist, her face turned upward toward him with an expression that was not fear and not confusion, but something closer to waiting, as though she already understood, on some level beneath words, that what happened in the next few seconds mattered more than anything that had come before. Marcus did not stagger. He did not raise his hands. He did not raise his voice. The force of the blow had turned his head to the right, and he brought it back slowly, not quickly, not with the speed of anger, but with the deliberate, unhurried movement of a man who had decided in advance exactly how he was going to respond to this and was simply executing that decision. He looked at Victoria with eyes that held no fury, no wounded pride, no shock, just a stillness so absolute it seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than the present moment. Victoria's hand was still raised. She lowered it. From the door, Bradley moved. He was a big man, 6'2", thick through the chest and shoulders, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the physical economy that came from a lifetime of professional discipline. He had worked private security for 12 years, the last 4 for Victoria, and he was very good at his job. He crossed the cafe floor in long, measured strides, positioned himself between his employer and Marcus, and prepared to do what he was paid to do. Then he looked at Marcus's face. The scar ran from the left temple down along the jaw in a long, pale curve, the specific, irregular shape left by fragmented metal traveling at high velocity, the kind of wound that didn't come from an accident or a fight, but from a very particular category of violence that Bradley understood from personal experience. He had last seen that scar on the night of March 14th, 2009, in a burning building on the outskirts of Kandahar, when the man wearing it had come back through a collapsing doorway for the second time to pull Bradley out by his vest, while his own face was actively bleeding onto the floor. Bradley stopped. The professional momentum that had carried him across the room simply stopped. He stood 3 feet from Marcus and did not move. The color went out of his face in a single, visible wave. His mouth opened slightly. For several seconds, he said nothing at all, and the silence around him was so complete that when he finally exhaled, people 2 tables away heard it. He took 1 step back. "I can't," he said. His voice came out uneven, not loud, barely above a murmur, but the room was quiet enough that it carried. He turned to look at Victoria, and his expression was something she had never seen on him before. "I can't do this. Not to this man." Victoria stared at him. "What are you talking about?" she said. Bradley didn't answer her. He was still looking at Marcus. "Bradley!" Victoria's voice carried the edge of someone who had never once had to repeat an instruction to an employee. "What are you doing? Do your job!" Bradley didn't move. "Ma'am," he said, still not looking at her, "I need you to understand something. I don't need you to explain anything to me. I need you to—" "Delta Force," Bradley said. "2nd Battalion, Special Forces Group, Kandahar Province, March 14th, 2009. The words came out quietly, but something in the way he said them made Victoria stop mid-sentence. Around them, the cafe remained in that suspended state of collective stillness. Nobody leaving, nobody speaking, every person present understanding without being told that something was happening that they needed to witness. "There was a building," Bradley continued. He was speaking to the room now as much as to Victoria, his voice steadier than his face looked. "A compound on the eastern edge of the city. We were there for an extraction, a hostage situation, classified operation, 6-man team. The compound had been booby-trapped. We didn't know until the first device went off." He paused. His jaw worked for a moment. 3 of us got out clean. 2 were confirmed down. I was trapped in the northeast corner of the 2nd floor. Ceiling partially collapsed. Both exits blocked, the whole structure burning around me. I had maybe 4 minutes before the smoke alone killed me. He stopped again. He came back in the first time and got Davis out. Davis had a broken leg, couldn't move on his own. He carried him out over his shoulder through a doorway that was already on fire. Several people near the counter had stopped pretending to look elsewhere. A man in his 60s, seated alone at a corner table, had set down his coffee cup and was sitting very straight, watching Bradley with an expression of quiet, focused attention. Then he went back in. Bradley said, "For me, the building was coming down. He had no reason to go back. Davis was out. The mission was technically complete. Any reasonable person would have called it done. He went back anyway. The second device detonated while he was on the stairs. That's where the scar came from. Fragmentation. He was still moving when it went off. He got to me. Got me to the window. Got me out." He exhaled slowly. "I never saw him again after that night. His records got pulled into a classification level I didn't have clearance for. I didn't even know his name until 6 months later." The man in the corner stood up. He was in his late 60s, gray-haired, with a posture that didn't belong to civilian life. He looked at Marcus and nodded once, a single, deliberate movement that communicated something specific to anyone who knew what to look for. Marcus looked back at him and nodded. "This is absurd," Victoria said. Her voice had lost some of its precision. Not much, but enough to be audible. "This is completely absurd. You're standing here telling me this man is some kind of—" "I'm telling you what I know," Bradley said. "I'm telling you what I saw. You could be making this up. He could have put you up to this. I don't know this man. I don't know anything about." "Ma'am." Bradley finally turned to look at her directly. His expression was not angry. It was something quieter and more final than anger. "I have the medical records. I have the incident report. I have a scar on my left side that matches the exit point of the same device that did that to his face. I'm not making anything up." Victoria opened her mouth. Then she closed it. For the first time since she had walked into the cafe that morning, she had nothing to say. The video had been recording for 11 minutes. A woman named Rachel, seated at the table directly behind Victoria, had started filming on her phone the moment the hot chocolate hit the floor. She had filmed the argument, the threats, the slap, Bradley's approach, and every word of what Bradley had just said. She had also, without fully deciding to, already uploaded it to 3 separate platforms before Bradley finished his last sentence. The first notification appeared on someone's phone 40 seconds later, then another, then 6 more in rapid succession from different tables, different devices. A cascade of buzzing and chiming that meant something had already escaped the room. It started in and was moving through the world on its own momentum. Victoria heard it. She looked around at the phones lighting up on tables around her, and for the first time that morning, her expression shifted into something that was not anger and not contempt, but something closer to the early stages of genuine alarm. The door opened. 2 police officers stepped into the cafe, not rushing, not with hands on anything, simply walking in the measured way that responded to a staff call rather than an emergency. They surveyed the room, identified the relevant geography of people and tension, and moved toward the center of it. The older of the 2, a sergeant named Doyle, broad-faced and unhurried, looked at Marcus first, then at Bradley, then at Victoria. "We got a call from the staff," he said. "Anybody want to tell me what happened?" 3 people started talking at once. Doyle held up one hand and they stopped. One at a time, Rachel stood up from her table and turned her phone around. "I have the whole thing on video," she said. "From the beginning." Doyle watched it. His partner watched it over his shoulder. The cafe was quiet enough that the thin audio from Rachel's phone was audible to the nearest tables. Victoria's voice, sharp and precise, telling Marcus she would have his daughter taken away. Then the sound of the slap. Then silence. Then Bradley's voice, steady and low, explaining Kandahar. Doyle handed the phone back to Rachel without expression. He looked at Victoria. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm going to need you to step outside with me." "I'm not going anywhere," Victoria said. "I want to file a complaint against—" "Ma'am," Doyle's voice didn't change in volume or temperature. "You're not being arrested. I'm asking you to step outside so we can take a statement and get some information from you. You're also being advised that based on the video evidence and the witness accounts in this room, you may be subject to a charge of simple assault. You are not required to say anything further until you've spoken with an attorney, which I understand is already on the way." He said it the way people say things that are not actually requests. Victoria looked at him. She looked at Bradley, who was standing very still with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the floor. She looked at Marcus, who was looking back at her with the same expression he had worn since the moment the slap landed. Not triumphant, not angry, simply present and immovable. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the door. Every person in the cafe watched her go. Nobody looked away. Nobody said anything. The only sound was the quiet, steady noise of her heels on the tile floor and the door swinging open into the morning light. Ava looked up at her father. "Daddy," she said quietly, "are you okay?" Marcus crouched down, wrapped both arms around her, and held her for a moment before he answered. "Yeah, baby," he said. "I'm okay." The video hit 2 million views before sundown. By midnight, it had been picked up by 4 national news outlets, shared by a veterans advocacy organization with 3 million followers, and featured in a cable news segment under the headline, CEO Attacks Decorated War Hero in Cafe. Caught on camera. By Sunday morning, Marcus Jackson's name was being spoken by people who had never been to his city, in conversations he had no part in and no control over. His phone had been off since noon on Saturday. He had turned it off in the parking lot of the cafe after the police had taken his statement and released him, while Ava was buckled into the back seat eating a granola bar he had found in the glove compartment. He had looked at the screen already filling with numbers he didn't recognize and turned it off with the deliberateness of a man closing a door he had no intention of reopening soon. Then he drove to the park. They were 40 minutes late, but the park didn't care. The swings were still there. The wide, flat stretch of grass near the south entrance was still there. Ava ran ahead of him down the path, the way she always did, her arms out slightly for balance on the uneven ground, and Marcus walked behind her with his hands in his pockets and the left side of his face still faintly warm from the morning. They stayed for 2 hours. On Monday, the consequences for Victoria Stanton began arriving in organized waves. Her company's board of directors called an emergency session. 3 corporate partners issued statements distancing themselves from her personally, while carefully avoiding any language that implicated the company. A 4th partner suspended their contract entirely pending review. By Tuesday afternoon, Victoria had been placed on a voluntary leave of absence from her role as CEO, the kind of voluntary that came with a board resolution and a prepared press statement, and no actual choice involved. Her attorneys filed a preliminary response characterizing the incident as a private dispute that had been misrepresented by selectively edited video. The statement lasted approximately 6 hours before the unedited 43-minute recording surfaced, at which point the attorneys issued a second statement that said considerably less. Marcus knew none of this in real time. He kept his phone off for 3 days. What he knew was Ava. She didn't talk about the cafe on Saturday. She didn't talk about it Sunday either, and he didn't push her. He had learned in 7 years of being her father that she processed things quietly on her own schedule, and then all at once when she was ready. It came on Sunday night. She was already in bed, the lamp on the nightstand turned down low when he came in to check on her. She was on her back, staring at the ceiling with the expression she wore when something was working itself out behind her eyes. "Daddy," she said without looking at him. "Have you ever been scared?" He sat down on the edge of her bed. He thought about the question the way it deserved to be thought about. "Yeah," he said. "Lots of times." She turned her head to look at him. "What did you do?" "I did what needed doing anyway," he said. "Being scared doesn't mean you stop. It just means you keep going while you're scared." She looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," she said finally, in the tone she used when she had filed something away permanently. He turned off the lamp. He sat with her in the dark until her breathing slowed and evened out into sleep. Then he sat there a little longer. The civil hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the incident. Victoria arrived without a motorcade. She came in a single car with one attorney and no bodyguard. Bradley had tendered his resignation the Monday after the cafe in a brief, professional email that said nothing beyond what was necessary. She wore a dark gray suit that was expensive, but not conspicuously so, and she walked into the building with the posture of someone who had decided in advance not to let the circumstances dictate how she carried herself, and was finding that harder than expected. The room was small, a municipal hearing chamber, 12 rows of seating, a raised platform at the front for the presiding officer. Marcus was already seated when she arrived at the table to the left of the center aisle. He was wearing a dark blue button-down shirt and the same quiet expression he had worn in the cafe. Ava was not present. He had arranged for her to spend the morning with a neighbor whose daughter was in Ava's class. The presiding officer called the session to order. Victoria's attorney stood first and delivered a prepared statement that was precise, measured, and almost entirely beside the point. It acknowledged the incident, contextualized it within the pressures of Victoria's professional obligations, and suggested that the public response had been disproportionate to the severity of what had actually occurred. It was the kind of statement that was technically accurate in almost every particular and true in almost none of them. When the attorney sat down, the presiding officer looked at Victoria. "Miss Stanton, do you wish to add anything?" Victoria looked at her attorney. He gave the smallest possible shake of his head, the universal signal for, "We've said what we need to say. Don't add to it." Victoria looked at Marcus. He was not looking at her with anger. He was not looking at her with satisfaction. He was simply looking at her the way he had looked at her in the cafe. Present, still, waiting for whatever came next, without any visible investment in what it would be. She stood up. "I want to say something," she said. "Not through counsel, just myself." Her attorney's expression did not change, but something around his eyes tightened. Victoria turned to face Marcus directly. "I watched the video," she said. "I watched it many times. I told myself the first few times that the context was missing, that people didn't understand the full situation, that the response was out of proportion." She paused. "I was lying to myself. The video showed exactly what happened. I said things to you and to your daughter that were designed to cause harm. And then I hit you, in front of your child, in front of a room full of people." Another pause, longer this time. "There is no version of that which is defensible. I know that. I knew it before I walked in here today." She did not look away from him. "I'm sorry. Not because I'm here and it's the appropriate thing to say because it's true, and I don't have anything else that's worth saying." The room was quiet. Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, the same way the veteran in the cafe had nodded at him that morning 6 weeks ago. Not forgiveness, not absolution, simply acknowledgement. The gesture of one person confirming that another person's words had been received. He didn't speak. The presiding officer proceeded with the formal findings. The terms of the judgment were entered into the record. Financial restitution, a formal injunction, the permanent notation that would follow Victoria's professional history, regardless of what she rebuilt or didn't rebuild afterward. Nothing was erased. Nothing was forgiven in the legal sense. The costs were real, and they were permanent, and Victoria paid them without attempting to negotiate them down. She had stopped trying to control the outcome the moment she stood up without her attorney's permission. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in early December, 4 months after the hearing. Marcus found it in the mailbox when he came home from picking Ava up from school, a plain white envelope with no return address, his name and apartment number written in careful, unhurried handwriting that suggested someone who had started over at least once before getting it right. He stood in the hallway outside his door and looked at it for a moment before opening it. Inside was a letter handwritten on a single sheet of plain white paper, and beneath it, wrapped in tissue, a small hardcover coloring book filled with detailed illustrations of horses, a dozen different breeds, in a dozen different settings, with a set of colored pencils tucked into a sleeve on the inside cover. He recognized it immediately. 3 weeks earlier, while walking past a bookstore on the way to the grocery store, Ava had stopped in front of the window display and pointed at that exact book with the focused certainty of a 7-year-old who knew precisely what she wanted. She had stood there for almost a full minute just looking at it. Marcus had made a mental note to come back. He hadn't made it back yet. The letter explained it simply. Victoria had been in that same bookstore 2 weeks after the hearing, looking for something meaningful to send rather than something expensive. She had asked the woman at the counter what books children loved most. The woman had pointed to the window display and mentioned that a little girl had stood outside, staring at it for a long time just recently. Victoria had bought it without hesitation. Some things find their way to the right place without being engineered to. Marcus stood in the hallway for a long time. Then he went inside. He set the book on the kitchen table and read the letter twice, standing up, before he folded it and placed it in the drawer where he kept important documents. Ava's birth certificate, his discharge papers, the photograph of his wife taken the summer before she got sick. The letter went in there without ceremony, in the company of the things he kept, because they mattered, and because they were true. He did not tell Ava where the book came from. When she came out of her room 20 minutes later and found it on the kitchen table, her reaction was everything. A 7-year-old's reaction to an unexpected gift is supposed to be immediate, total, and completely uncomplicated by any of the history attached to it. She climbed into her chair, opened the cover, and began examining each page with the seriousness of someone assessing a significant undertaking. After a moment, she looked up at him. "Who gave this to us?" Marcus sat down across from her. He thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest without being more than she needed to carry right now. "Someone who's trying to be better," he said. Ava considered this carefully. "Are they doing okay?" she asked. "I think so," Marcus said. "I think they're working on it." Ava nodded, apparently satisfied, and turned back to her book. Marcus watched her select a pencil burnt orange, for reasons that were entirely her own, and begin filling in the outline of a horse standing in a field. Her tongue pressed slightly against her lower lip, the way it always did when she was concentrating. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and fell across the table, and across her hands, and across the open pages of the book. The scar on Marcus's face caught the light, the way it always did, that long, pale ridge running from temple to jaw. The mark of a particular night in a burning building far from this kitchen, from this table, from this ordinary and unrepeatable afternoon. He didn't think about Kandahar. He watched his daughter draw a horse and thought about nothing at all. Power can make people feared, but character is what makes them remembered. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, subscribe.